All right. Thank you for joining us today. We're excited to talk about growing up in the Lone Star State with authors Gaylon Finklea and Marianne Odom. If you have questions, please post them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end of the program. So I'm going to start by introducing our authors. Native Texans Gaylon Finklea and Marianne Odom have been collecting oral histories since 1981 and collaborated on The Businesses That Built San Antonio, a coffee table book of first-person accounts of business leaders published to commemorate the Texas sesquicentennial in 1986. Gaylon is the author of 4 books concerning Texas history and a journalist whose work has appeared in the San Antonio Light, San Antonio Express News, SA, the magazine and Newsweek. She edited the Jewish Journal in San Antonio and the Jewish Outlook in Austin. She is a journalism graduate of the University of Texas at Austin. Marianne covered fashion for the San Antonio Express News and was a reporter for the Tyler Courier Times Telegraph and contributing editor for Edible San Antonio. The longtime educator is a journalism professor at San Antonio College and has a master's degree from Texas A&M University Commerce and a bachelor's from the University of North Texas. So welcome to both of you. We're so glad to have you. I know you guys are going to start with the presentation, so I will turn it over to you.
Okay, so I'm Gaylon, and I'm from Hull in deep East Texas, the Southeast Texas, and I now live in Austin.
And I'm Marianne, and I am from Tyler, a little bit north of Hull in East Texas, and I now live in San Antonio. We are both quite proud to be native Texans, just like all the interviewees in our book. And I want to give you all a little warning just to start with. We may appear as shameless name droppers. However, we don't apologize for praising some of the most outstanding Texans that have ever lived. So let me tell you a little bit about what our book is about. In growing up in the Lone Star State, 47 famous Texans recall in their own words what it was about their childhoods in Texas in the first half of the 20th century that gave them the courage to follow their dreams. Those dreams led to successful careers in Hollywood, Broadway, music, sports, politics, TV journalism, and much more. So we have a book that is full of very dear, intimate stories of history, memoir. Some of the stories are happy, some are sad, some are funny, a lot are inspirational. Well, you may be wondering, well, what is there about Texas that made people be able to be successful? To put it simply, most believe in Texas exceptionalism. They talk about the sheer size of the state, the unique history. You know, Texas was its own country, so we have quite an independent spirit. Many referred to the pioneer spirit of our ancestors. They also mention the magnificence and diversity of the state's geography and the idea that Texas offers endless opportunities. So our 47 notable Texans are truly proof that Texas is a good place for a good start in life. And then to tell you how the book got started, Gaylon's going to start that.
Okay, so we began this long journey in the early 1980s. We like to recall when we were young and cute, and we look like the picture here. We were office mates in the tiniest office ever in the Express News, this beautiful building here, which was only 2 blocks from the Alamo. And it was during a time that was very important to Texas.
Texas was hot in the early part of the 1980s. The movie Urban Cowboy was filmed in Pasadena, which was something in itself, and it really swept the country. Suddenly, cowboy hats, boots, line dancing were everywhere. It kind of kicked disco out of the clubs. The Broadway musical, The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, became a popular movie. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, can't get more Texas than that, played on Times Square, and everyone was talking about the TV series Dallas.
So it wasn't just the popular part of America. In politics, George H.W. Bush was our new vice president. And Ronald Reagan also was sort of a cowboy type. And when they were inaugurated the first time, the Express News sent Marianne and me to cover the inauguration. That was, in January 81. And during that period, we've never worked harder in our life or gotten less sleep. What it did for us was to show that we were really good, hardworking people together. We could get it done, and we had fun doing it. And we could use those qualities later on. So that was really an important time. And closer to home then, we worked for the Scene Lifestyle Department. And so it was a round robin who got to write what story for the holidays. Marianne wrote this lovely tribute to her father on Father's Day. And there was a new holiday called Grandparents' Day. Just knew about that period. And so I wrote about my Granny Finklea. And actually, out of all of the many, many stories we wrote over the years, we got more response from the readers from these two down-home, sweet, dear, personal memories than anything else we wrote. And at the time, there was a woman in San Antonio who was our local poet. And she wrote us this note that very much validated what we were trying to do. She said, perhaps the real treasure of good autobiographical material is not only the insight it gives into other people's lives and histories, but the sudden, sharper awareness of every moment is history in every life. Articles like yours can make us more human, more alive, wherever we are. Our heads swelled at that, but it gave us really good support that was the kind of writing people like to see.
So far in the early 1980s, we took note of the national and international focus on Texas and all things kind of Western, and the universal appeal of reflections on growing up. Then we couldn't help but notice an inordinate number of famous people who claim Texas roots. So we started lists, and these were back in the days when you couldn't just, search something on the internet. We had to call the library, we had to seek out who's who and biographical references, trying to determine who really was from Texas and who wasn't. So we decided that we would ask native Texans, what about growing up on Texas soil, again, if anything, made them successful? We really wanted their granny and daddy stories. Once we kind of got it crystallized, we thought, we think there's a book in this. Now, we had to set some standards. And the big thing we found out was a lot of people you think were from Texas weren't. Some people like Walter Cronkite came here when they were very young and claimed to be Texans, but they weren't native. So once we sorted that out, we did require they had to be a native. The person had to be at the top of their game. It could be in any field, but they had to be really at the peak of their success. They had to be at least nationally known, though most are internationally known. They had to have spent all of or most of their formative years in Texas, and they had to have good stories to tell. Not surprisingly, when we got to people, they all wanted to talk about growing up in Texas.
So early on, probably all of you who are listening might remember that James Michener came to Texas and lived here for several years. He had research assistants assigned to him, graduate students from UT, to help him research and write Texas. And, it was a big, huge thing. Texas was hot, as Marianne said. And what made it hot was James Michener here, too, on the literary level. And so he came to San Antonio to be a marshal in one of the Fiesta parades, and I was the one that drew the lucky straw to get to interview him for the parade. And so we met downtown on the Riverwalk for what I thought he would spill the beans about what was in Texas and how far along he was and whatnot. He told me nothing. He was the absolute worst interview I guess I can remember, because he was so close-mouthed about what he was doing. He knew what I was doing. I was trying to get it out of him, and it wasn't going to happen. But we spent 2 lovely hours just talking about stuff. And I got very brave. Here I am sitting with James Michener, and I told him about our book idea and what we were doing. And at the end, he slapped me on the knee and he said, "You're going to have a bestseller. This is a fantastic idea." So talk about validation. So the interviews had already begun when James Michener said, "Good idea, girls." We love to do the interviews together when we can, but sometimes it falls to one or the other of us. As it turns out, I happen to be the very first interviewer, and I did the very last interview. So the first one is this handsome guy here with a drink in his hand. This is folklorist Geach Cook, who you might remember, he and Willie own Lukenbach, Texas. And that's when the song Lukenbach, Texas was so famous. He was just what we were looking for. He was tall and handsome and funny. He came in a white cowboy hat and boots, and he sidled up to the bar and got himself a drink. And we had a fun time together. And so that started it all right next to the Alamo. We were in the Minger bar where Teddy Roosevelt raised the Rough Riders. How much more historic could that be? And to contrast that with our last one was State Rep Symphonia Thompson. And I interviewed her in her office suite in the Capitol. She had about as opposite an upbringing as Geach had. So it made a good compare and contrast. So by 1986 or so, in short order, really, we had 27 or so interviews done. Not just done, but transcribed, broken up into anecdotes. We sent them out to the people we'd interviewed. They hand edited their chapters, and they sent us personal photos. Then after this great start, we have to admit this, but we let life get in the way out of all of this wonderful forward progress. You might think we're slackers because we let that happen, although we think we're pretty big go-getters. But other than sending out sample chapters to a publisher now and again, we simply took a 27-year break.
So we're going to fast forward to 2013. There was a twist of fate in our personal lives that rekindled our long-distance friendship and the project. We dusted it off. Actually, we had to get it into the modern technology, which we did. Then we wrote bios, we sought missing photos, and so on. Fortunately, we had been smart enough to interview about childhoods, and those hadn't changed in all that time. But our 27 chapters from 30 years ago didn't really reflect the mosaic that is modern Texas. There were areas that were not covered. So we began interviewing again. And from 2016 to 2018, we added an additional 19 chapters. Now, and I'm not sure exactly what this says about us, but honestly, we have the most fun together when we're working. I know that doesn't sound normal, but it's actually true. We are truly worker bees. So in addition to our hard work, however, we honestly believe that about 2015, 16 or so, the project kind of began to take a life of its own as we were expanding it and finally brought it to a conclusion in the last 5 years. So we will take you through some of the highlights of some of the interviews. If we don't talk about an interview or a chapter in the book that you're interested in, please ask us a question, but we kind of picked out some of the highlights.
So we want to start with people, of course, from Fort Worth. So Dan Jenkins, there in the middle. the beloved sports writer from Fort Worth, especially golf. He has a huge following. That's Marianne there with him in his wife's New York City Mexican restaurant. And it was on my happy birthday. Talking about working on your birthday, it was about the best present I could ever have. Dan Jenkins is hysterical. We had a great day. And then next to him is Bob Schieffer, the ultimate CBS newsman. And he's known, probably some of you know, he's told this story so many times. He happened to be in the newspaper office when Mrs. Oswald called and said she was looking for somebody to drive her to the jail where her son was. He had supposedly shot President Kennedy. And Bob Schieffer drove her to the jail. Sandra Brown down here in the corner, that's Marianne and me at her house in Arlington. We're looking through her childhood pictures. She, has more than 81 million books in print. She wins a New York Times bestseller award every year and has for decades. And she writes a book a year. Liz Smith over there. This is a picture on one of her columns that we took when a bunch of Texans did a fundraiser for a theater in New York. She is everybody's favorite New York social scene writer because she could ditch some dirt. You'll remember. And then the guy at the bottom down there is Delbert McClinton. He's a dreamy Grammy Award winning blues man. And when he tells stories, it's like he's a poet. Then we have to brag. Who knew this? I wish we could see everybody's hand. Who knew that both Peter Pans are from Texas? Mary Martin is from Weatherford, and Sandy Duncan is from Tyler. So we sort of categorize these. These are the ones we call our notables in public life. Well, I grew up near Houston where NASA was, and during that period we were planning to go to the moon, and it was so thrilling. So I just had to have an astronaut, and we got Robert Crippen, the guy in the middle there with us. He is our astronaut, and he piloted the very first shuttle mission. It hadn't even been tested. He put himself on top of a bomb, basically, and went off into space. And he said fear had nothing to do with it. So at the bottom over here is Rex Tillerson. Toward the end, we were looking for categories of people who you think are Texans. So we needed an oil man. And we couldn't get a bigger oil man than Rex because he was the former CEO and chairman of the board of ExxonMobil. But then later, of course, he became Secretary of State. And in person, I have to say, he's a teddy bear who loves genealogy. And there we are with his mother's genealogy works of their family. He was really fun. And then, of course, everybody's favorite first lady, at least every Texan anyway, is Lady Bird. And she was among our first interviews. And we had such a lovely day rocking on the porch in those big old rocking chairs at the LBJ Ranch. And as it turns out, this was sort of foreshadowing. The Briscoe Center sent an oral historian to also record our interview. So that interview from way back then is somewhere in the bowels of the Briscoe.
And then we know how big sports is in Texas. So I'll start with Jerry Levias. He broke the color barrier in the Southwest Conference in 1965 by playing football on scholarship for SMU. He was probably our longest interview. We sat around his breakfast table in Houston for probably 4.5 hours, spellbound by his stories of growing up and playing football in Beaumont and his experiences in Fort Worth. AJ Foyt, this was at his headquarters in Waller. He now manages racing teams. He is, shall we say, a colorful guy. We had told him when we started that we read a biography about him, and he pretty much told us in no uncertain terms he didn't like that biography written about him. It was unauthorized. So we got a little nervous, but he was a great interview, and we have since heard from his PR person that he loves our chapter. So we are quite relieved, but he was a wonderful story growing up in Houston. Nolan Ryan, obviously, I don't need to tell anyone who he is. We tried for about 2 years to get Nolan, and we are really poster children for persistence. He didn't keep telling us complete no, it was just not yet. Finally, we talked to his assistant who said, he has finally decided to do the interview because he knows you're going to ask the kinds of questions that he doesn't normally get. And he was very intrigued by that. So he also obviously could have lived anywhere in the world, and he chose to raise his own family in Alvin so they could have the same type of small town upbringing that he had, which I think says a lot. Leon Coffey is a rodeo clown, and he was probably our shortest interview. We only had about 30 minutes with him before performance at the San Antonio Stock Show and Rodeo. And he was bam, 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 excellent storyteller. We didn't need more than 30 minutes. He has a great chapter. Ben Crenshaw, this is at the Lions Municipal Golf Course in Austin. We basically sat inside and he looked out at the greens where he had grown up playing golf. And he really, really sees golf as a metaphor for life. So his whole chapter was really, really interesting.
So then we have a whole lot of notables who were in the media. We have Dan Rather here in front of this Texas neon sign. He was one of our best chapters. Of course, we can't decide which is our top 10 even, much less our best. But he was a great storyteller, and he turns 90 this year on Halloween. We'll never forget the day we interviewed him at CBS News in his office. That was when he had succeeded Walter as the anchor and the managing editor. Walter was down the hall, and Dan offered to introduce us, but Walter was not a native Texan. So we turned that offer down. Silly girls that we were. We had our specs. Walter had been born in Missouri, so he would have never made the cut. Big mistake. But you see, Liz Carpenter here, she is a great example of how these Texans know each other, and they wanted to talk about Texas. So as it so happened at the Express News, our boss, Mildred Whittaker, was a college roommate of Liz Carpenter. And so she got us to Liz Carpenter, of course. And Liz got us to Ladybird. And so once you have somebody like Liz and Ladybird in a project, it shows the other people we would like to include that we were doing a worthwhile project. So it's easier for them to say yes. The guy and gal in the middle, that's Phyllis George. You know, she broke the glass ceiling in TV sports. And Joe Armstrong, you might not know his name, but you know him because he is a publishing mogul who as a very young man saved Rolling Stone magazine from going down the tubes, because he was able to convince big-time advertisers to put big-time money into this wavering young magazine by convincing them that Rolling Stone and what they were doing was worthy. And then the lady at the bottom down there is Sarah McClendon. What a storyteller. And she was funny as she could be. And I met her in the press room at the White House. So it was my one time to actually sit in on a press conference. as two redheads, as you can see. She gave multiple presidents headaches for the great questions. She asked them hard questions always. But that day, she was nothing but kind and generous to me and a really great storyteller. Then everybody, of course, knows handsome Rex Reed over there, who could really trash a movie. But with us, he was wonderful. He was a great storyteller and very colorful how he talked. And, we're lucky to have him and all of them. We ended up loving every one of these people.
These are some of what I kind of call America's sweethearts. Phyllis George. We actually interviewed her by phone. She was one of only two. We did phones. We knew she had had some health treatments. We didn't know what they were, but she did not want to see us in person. We kept after her. We had some help trying to convince her to do it. But so we did her on the phone, and then she's so warm and friendly. She said, call me Phil. And then after the interview, we were texting back and forth and emailing and sending grandbaby pictures, and we felt like girlfriends. I'm sure she has thousands of girlfriends, but that was just kind of the warm, down-home Texas soul that she was. It was, of course, horribly sad for us when she died last spring. We were very shocked and very disappointed. Tommy Tune, the Broadway choreographer and dancer, you can see he has those long legs. He is a 6'6" Texan. He really played up that long, tall Texan when he moved to New York. But I interviewed him in his apartment in Manhattan. And at the time, there was sort of a minimalist style of decorating, actually a style of not decorating, and he had no furniture. So we sat on the floor of his living room. I think there were a couple pillows, but he basically stretched out those long legs and we talked Texas, and he was really charming. Debbie Reynolds, again, another one I think everyone would consider America's sweetheart. We interviewed her in her hotel after a performance at the Majestic Theater in San Antonio. After the performance, she came in, put on a velour sweatsuit, put her feet up on the coffee table, and told us incredible stories of growing up very poor in El Paso. And now that you've seen the glamour part of our project, like any other major undertaking, most of the work is much less exciting. It's done behind the scenes. We did it late at night, early in the morning, weekends. Since we live in different cities, most of the work was not in the same location, although it was great when it was. We call it our marathons, when we get together for 2 or 3 days and literally work type our fingers to the bone.
And so we kept it going for several reasons. One was, Texans' word is their bond. And we said we were going to do this. But also, y'all have to know, there is the thrill of the chase. It's addictive. And there's also the satisfaction of completing what you start. So this is how we looked the day we got word that Jacqueline Smith said, yes, we will do an interview. And that's compared to 1981 over here. We're in New York City, and that's how we're celebrating on the day we'd interviewed Dan Reathers, Sandy Duncan, and Liz Smith all in one day. It was work. It was work. And we weren't familiar with New York, but we did it. And as you see, we were pretty happy about it. And that sort of a thrill really gets into your bones, I guess, especially if you're a journalist and you're always looking for the next. So we call it the thrill of the chase. And so we say you should never, ever, anybody, give up on what you think is a really good idea. Like Marianne said, we're the children of persistence. Persistence is our middle name. You just never know what you can do. So this is Jacqueline Smith here, obviously, Charlie's Angels. we had thought about trying to get her before, but we actually thought she was probably out there too much. It would never happen. And during one of these marathons, Marianne talked about, we just said, oh, what the heck? Let's send an email to her PR guy. And lo and behold, within an hour or two, he had written back and said, would you like to come to her house in Hollywood on Sunset Boulevard and do this interview? And we said, we'll be there. All right.
This is part of that life of its own. Jacqueline, when you see her chapter, she was very, very close to her parents, and she cried quite a bit during the interview. Well, afterward, she tweeted about it. It meant so much to her. And you know how that stuff works today. So the Daily Mail in London picked it up, had it on the internet. And so it was picked up in news feeds, and there were, you know, mentions and things about this from Australia to, you know, Scandinavia. So it really made us realize that, you know, this is something really big here. We didn't have anything to do with this publicity, but it really was at least a huge upper for us.
It started out on the Daily Mail in London. And it's like, are you kidding us? So we, you know, we have to say, you can't go 40 years and do this alone. We're lucky to have each other. We work off of each other. Our spirit soothes and encourages each other. But it took hundreds of people who helped us to get this book done. And so you ought to check out the acknowledgements. We tried to mention everybody who did something important to get this book together. But, you know, there is always somebody who ends up being very special in a project. And for us, it's this Joe Armstrong down here. Joe Armstrong, we call him Joe A+. He is our cheerleader. He is always there in our corner. He's pushing us harder, to work harder, to get this person. Why can't you get a story in that newspaper? Blah, blah, blah. Here's the lead. He calls us the Thelma and Louise of Texas letters. And one day I'm Thelma, and the next day I'm Louise, and Marianne too. It all depends on our attitude that day and what's going on. But in our minds, Joe Armstrong has told us we're Thelma and Louise, and that means we got it together and we're in control. And by golly, with our persistence that we learned in our own childhoods, we're going to get this thing done. And we did.
In addition to the beautiful book that was produced by the Briscoe Center at UT Austin, we think they did a fantastic job, particularly using a lot of the historic photos from their own collection, which greatly enhanced the book. They also recognize the historic significance of what we have. And so they have our archives. So the actual recordings, the transcripts, the hand edited pages, the correspondence, all of that material will be available through the Briscoe archive. So we are very grateful that they recognize the importance of this, and they really made it all come together. And of course, we were very thankful they published this book. So I think that pretty much concludes our actual presentation, but we'd love to answer questions.
All right. So I'm actually going to start with some of the questions we have in the chat. And then I have some other questions too, but let's start with those so we make sure we get to those. After all those years of hard work, well, and you kind of just answered this, but after all those years of hard work, what do you do with all your research notes, drafts, and recordings when you're finished with them? So in this case, they went to the Briscoe, but if they hadn't gone to the Briscoe, what would you normally do with them?
Well, we kind of laughed that, you know, we didn't want to just leave our stuff in a box or a file drawer that our children would just throw out one day because it wouldn't have meaning to them. So I'm not sure. Gaylon is honestly one of the reasons we pulled this all together is so even though, you know, we both moved several times, Gaylon had kept pretty much everything. So she had the files, and we still have copies of things, but we are grateful that it's in the Briscoe.
Yeah, my daughter is particularly happy about it. She said, Mom, rather than me having to decide what to do with all of your stuff, it's going to be available for researchers in perpetuity. And I said, yes, ma'am, it is. So, and my house is so clean, Marianne's too. You know, file drawers under the bed, all that stuff that people worry about when you're dead. Well, we've already taken care of that. So we're a step ahead.
Are there any ones that got away? Meaning any notables you really wanted to interview, but it just didn't happen?
We both could chime in here. Yes, there were quite a few. You know, people had to say yes. Sometimes it was a scheduling problem that, you know, our schedules wouldn't mesh at the time that we could do it. So that was part of it. But I really wanted Earl Campbell. I am from Tyler, you know, and he's quite the hero in Tyler, and his mother was almost as big of a legend in Tyler as he was. So I wanted to hear those stories. And we tried and tried and tried with all kinds of different people who knew him, his son, and the coach who had recruited him. And it just never happened. So that was a big disappointment to me.
We had many disappointments. A big one I thought would have been great to be in here was Sandra Day O'Connor. She was born in El Paso. And she's written some books, even children's books, about how she grew up in Arizona, you know, way out in the country on the ranch. Well, because they were way out in the country on the ranch, there wasn't a good school nearby. And she was obviously very bright. So for her schooling, she spent time in El Paso with her grandma. And she went to school there. And that's something she hadn't really written about. And I wished we could have asked her about that. It would have filled a part of history that I'm not so sure is easily accessible. But there were others too. There was like Kenny Rogers and Sly Stone. We wanted Laura Bush. You know, we had Lady Bird. We also wanted Laura. We also chased George Foreman.
Yes.
For 3 or 4 years. He would have been wonderful. And Willie Nelson, of course, Willie was evasive. And so we thought his sister, Bobby, who raised him, would even be a better chapter. And as it turned out, the timing just never worked. She said yes, she said no. People changed their mind a lot. You know, that's where the persistence came in too. We didn't always take no for an answer. We'd wait a year or so, you know, it's 40 years, we could wait a year. And ask them again, and they probably forgot about us the first time. Sometimes that worked, and sometimes it didn't.
I'm sure with all the folks you talked to were interesting, but is there any particular one or ones whom you would cite as having the most surprising and unexpected story to tell?
Oh, wow. Very good question. Well, some of the stories, I'd say Jerry LaBias has one that's you need to read it. So I'd say his is definitely one, but there are others that, I mean, a lot of them are different. So it's really hard to pick out one that is more surprising than the other. Some people were motivated kind of out of a negative thing, such as Jimmy Dean. He wanted to prove to the world that he was as good as anybody else because he had been kind of bullied as a child because he was so poor. So those kinds of things were not what we had expected. And he came out very successful, obviously, but there were little things like that were surprising. Gaylon, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, we'd like to say that this is a fun read and an easy read, and you don't have to start at the first chapter and go all the way through. You can pick and choose. But also, there's a lot deeper than that. We think what we've captured here is the importance of childhoods and how your experiences and what you see and hear and how your family does things, that helps mold you into the adult, and in our case, success, the adult success you become. And so they're all very important from where they came from as a child. And some of us thought we knew these people because 80% of them were household names in America. But we really didn't know them and until we knew how they grew up. And then you can kind of put two and two together. Sometimes the motivation was poverty, and sometimes people were just as motivated if they grew up with a silver spoon. There's some drive in these people, and most of them credited some part of being a Texan with helping them get there, or want to get there, or struggle to get there. And that all started in their childhoods.
So can you talk about why you decided to do childhood stories in the beginning?
That's another really good question. I think because we really wanted to see kind of it early on in the 1980s, they called it a Texas, quote, mystique. And that was, what is there about Texas at all? You know, all these famous people are from Texas and they all kind of share a camaraderie. I mean, we have all kinds of stories of how they get together in New York and stuff like that. And so we thought probably that must have come from their growing up in Texas. So that's where we started. We ended up in the book. We have a lot of information that really did not all make the chapters, but we stopped all the chapters with as they started in their career. So any stories they told us, you know, about few while they were in their career are not in the book. They're in the archives. But so it ends up being childbirth to whatever time they started their career, and most started their careers young. So,
all right. So obviously this is a book you've been working on for a while. Can you talk about the actual interview and research process, especially because you did it one way in the beginning, and I'm assuming a totally different way come 2016. And how then you take all of that information and you translate it to words on a page.
Okay, so in the beginning, of course, there was no internet. There was barely even an answering machine or fax. Fax was sort of new too. I know that will blow some people's minds. So to get in touch with them was by the phone and by what we now call snail mail. And at the time, we were journalists working for a credible big town newspaper. And we brought that sort of professionalism to the early interviews. And we told the people it was, you know, exactly their childhood and nothing else much. And we did not send them questions such as, tell us about your grandma, tell us about your favorite foods, none of that. So it was all spur of the moment, like a real reporter. We didn't even take our pictures with these people. The 27 chapters we did early on, because that journalists just don't do that. You know, that makes you become a fan. And as a journalist, you're not a fan. So we really regret that. So later on, after all of those decades of it just sitting there, the world had changed. And we now had the internet, and we had email was coming on. And it was totally different. We decided that it would be better. We weren't working for a newspaper or a magazine any longer if we helped prepare the people for what we were going to ask. And so we started sending around a list of questions. And actually, that was very helpful. Like Marianne mentioned earlier, Nolan Ryan did it because of the questions. Jerry Levias really did it because of the questions. The person helping set up the interview said, could you send him the questions? He's so sick of answering the same ones over and over. And the reason we spent 4.5 hours with him was we sent him an unbelievably long list of possible questions, knowing we'd never get to them all. But he had studied them and had an answer for them. And by golly, he wanted to tell us. And he did. And it was the most inspirational and emotional day you can imagine.
So early on, we had a portable cassette tape recorder, about the size of, I like to say, a cornbread pan. And we hauled that around and we used tapes. And honestly, you know, we were kind of casual about the tapes. I don't think we really took the care that, you know, we did later, but we later had to have those digitized, and the quality of some of the early ones is not as good as we certainly have now. But, you know, we wrote on a manual typewriter. We, you know, cut and pasted, literally cut and pasted as we were editing each other's work. So it was really quite different. It was much, much easier in the after 2013. But one reason that it kind of held us from doing it anymore was we thought we couldn't access the data because we had it on floppy disks finally. Well, floppy disks, nobody could read those. So around 2012 or so, we learned that we could have the hard copies that we had scanned. So we had those put through a scanner, and then we had files. We had to kind of work with the files, but we had the data without us rekeying it. So that was huge. But the changes in technology obviously were tremendous and really enhanced our ability to finish it in a much faster, much more professional manner.
So I have to tell you about professional manner. So Marianne and I, little East Texas country girls, we go to the big city of New York. We're going to visit Dan Rather at CBS News. And we have our little cassette recorder, and we have our extra cassettes. And we go to the CBS News cafeteria before we go up to Dan's office, you know, to double check to make sure the darn thing works. And it worked fine. And we went up to Dan's office, and we were sitting there, and it's time to punch the button for the tape to start. And the darn thing broke or didn't work or jammed or something. Here is our big day. We're so professional and what to do. And Dan Rather is such a gentleman's gentleman. He said, ladies, it's lucky for you. This is CBS News. And we have a few tape recorders around. And so his secretary brought us one that worked.
Do you have any other funny anecdotes like that? Ones that kind of just stick out in your head?
Let me think. I don't know.
Well, let me.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, let me say that we lived with these people so long. We call them by their first names, you know, as if they were our first cousin or something. There are a few that we respect so much that we say Dr. Cavazos and we say Mr. Reyes, but we very often say Sinfronia and Dan and Bob and Ben and whoever, and we know who we're talking about, you know, because they are so dear to us. And I suspect when the readers read these chapters, they'll feel they couldn't possibly feel as dear as Marianne and I are, but they will know these people better and feel kindly toward them.
Well, and obviously when you're talking to people about their dearest memories of mom, dad, grandpa, you know, favorite teachers, you know, those kinds of things, they are opening their hearts and sharing their dearest memories. So there's a natural closeness that you wouldn't get if you were just interviewing on their latest, you know, sports achievement. So that was a big part of it, and they were willing to share that. They wanted to talk about that.
They wanted to talk about Texas, and several of them either teared up or outright cried, like Jacqueline Smith. Right. Now we won't tell you who the Crybabies are, but I have to tell you, it was emotional for all of us. Because it's obvious this really is what formed these people. They're telling these anecdotes, and some of them put 2 and 2 together from our questions. that they'd never thought of before, such as Henry Cisneros. We asked him what kind of toys he played with, and he jumped up and went to another room and came back with a little metal pickup truck that he played with in the dirt when he was a kid. And he said he designed streets and byways and places where houses should be. And he grew up to be the Secretary of HUD. So he was designing infrastructure with that little truck when he was a kid. And he said, I have never articulated this before. And that's when he put two and two together. And that kind of proves our point, that the things you do and see and are around and are familiar with as a kid, that can carry throughout the rest of your life. I wish we were involved with some child psychologist who could tell us more about that, because I really think that's an important topic that comes out of this book.
I would like to expand on the process. I don't think we answered that as well, but the way we did this is that we did the interview. We sent the questions, we did the interview, we taped it. Gaylon transcribed every word of the transcript.
Never try that, y'all. Don't do that. That is the worst in the world.
So then we edited down the transcripts into anecdotes. And, sometimes you may talk about grandma in the beginning, but she comes up again at the end. And so we put that together. The only thing we could not do is we could not change their words. We could edit out, but we could not add to their words. So as a writer, that was a little challenging. So we did the anecdotes and we arranged them in different ways so all the chapters wouldn't sound alike. And when we were happy with it, and we were passing these back and forth, and we were happy with it, then we sent the edited version back to the person so they could correct the spelling, or if they'd misspoken or they thought of something else. Some people added things they thought of, I want to add this. Other people, like Red McComb, said it's perfect as it is, didn't change a word. So we do have the hand edits, and we're very grateful for those, because sometimes we hear something or we didn't stop to say, how do you spell that? So that was the process. And then later we researched and did the bios and did other things, but that's the way we did it. So they are edited oral histories. We've taken out all the uh-huhs and that kind of thing. And they're not a transcript. So they're much more readable that way. And really nobody quibbled with what we chose to include. Again, some people added things, but no one said, oh, please don't say that. They really liked what we chose because we picked out the most poignant or the things we thought were important, and they pretty much agreed.
All right. Well, I actually think that is a great place to leave it. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And thank you, Marianne and Gaylon. I hope everyone enjoyed our discussion. If you would like to purchase a copy of the book, you can pick those up at the dock, and I'm going to put their contact information up on the screen here for you. So you can pick those up at the dock bookshop, and here's their contact information. And we hope that you join us again for some more of our upcoming programs. And thank you again, and everyone have a great evening.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer.